If you arrived here at dawn, before the heat began to rise off the sand, you might think you had stepped into another century. Not because time stopped, not because the modern world never reached this place, but because the things that still matter most here were perfected long before engines, power lines, and asphalt roads ever crossed the desert. A leather bag, a hand-forged blade, a camel saddle, a goatskin tent, a wooden bowl, a kettle for tea, a veil against the wind, and the memory of where water lies when the land looks empty. The title says this desert tribe has not used modern tools in 800 years. That is not literally true, and the truth is more interesting than the myth. Because the Tuareg of the Sahara are not people frozen in time. They are not relics. They are not survivors by accident. They are the heirs to a way of life so precisely adapted to heat, distance, silence, and scarcity that many of its core tools never needed to be reinvented. That is the part outsiders struggle to understand. Modernity reached the desert, but the desert did not surrender. Among the Tuareg, across parts of Niger, Mali, Algeria, Libya, and beyond, life has long been shaped by movement. Not random wandering, but movement with intelligence, movement with memory, movement that follows pasture, protects animals, avoids danger, and turns survival into a form of knowledge. In a city, wealth often means what you can store. In the Sahara, wealth has often meant what you can carry. And what you can carry has to earn its place. A saddle is not just transport, it is engineering. A tent is not just shelter, it is climate control. A veil is not just clothing, it is filtration, shade, protection, privacy, identity. Even a tea set is not a luxury object. It is ritual, hospitality, pause, and social glue in a landscape that can strip life down to necessity. To people looking from the outside, those objects can seem old. To people living here, they are simply correct. That is why so many of them endure. The Sahara punishes bad design. Anything fragile breaks. Anything heavy becomes a burden. Anything wasteful becomes a liability. So the tools that survived here were the ones tested by generations against wind, thirst, distance, and heat. A tent made from skin and supported by carved poles can be dismantled, carried, repaired, and raised again. A leather bag can travel for days with a caravan. A wooden bowl can outlast plastic in sun and sand. A hand-forged blade can be sharpened, repaired, inherited. A camel saddle can mean the difference between movement and isolation. This is not nostalgia. It is selection pressure, operating over centuries. And in that pressure, the Tuareg became masters of a difficult equation. How to remain mobile without becoming vulnerable. How to carry a home without carrying too much. How to live in an environment that constantly asks what is essential and what is excess. Even the objects around a Tuareg camp tell that story. A low bed, leather bags hanging from a frame, tea-making items near the center of gathering, decorated saddles, tools, musical instruments, amulets, weapons once necessary not just for status, but for protection. The desert does not separate beauty from function as neatly as modern industrial life does. Among the Tuareg, a useful thing can also be elegant. A saddle can be richly decorated. A bag can carry both necessity and identity. A cross pendant can be ornament, memory, and meaning at once. That is why outsiders so often describe Tuareg life as aesthetic. But beauty here is not extra. Beauty is part of endurance. To make something well is to make it last. To decorate something is to say it belongs to a people, not just to a task. And behind many of those objects stands one of the most important figures in traditional Tuareg life: the artisan, the smith, the maker. In some Tuareg communities, the Anadan, the artisan class, historically made nearly everything necessary for desert survival: tents, bags, saddles, swords, pottery, keys, padlocks, lances, beds, jewelry, musical instruments, repairs, alterations, improvements. What looks from far away like a simple camp in the sand is actually the visible edge of an entire ecosystem of skill. Nothing exists alone. A veil depends on weaving. A tent depends on leatherwork. A saddle depends on wood, hide, and metal. A blade depends on forge knowledge. A journey depends on all of them at once. And because mobility has always been central, the Tuareg did not build a civilization around permanent walls in the way outsiders often expect. They built one around relationships, roots, memory, craft, and the animal that made long-distance life possible: the camel. The camel is often romanticized by people who have never needed one. But in the Sahara, the camel was not scenery. It was infrastructure. It carried goods, people, tents, tools, milk, trade, and possibility itself. It linked camps to wells, markets to families, caravans to survival. It widened the range of the human body. It allowed a people to inhabit distances that would otherwise be unbearable. And once you understand that, you begin to understand why the idea of modern tools can be misleading here. Because what counts as advanced depends on where you are standing. In a city, advanced means speed. In the desert, advanced often means reliability. In a city, advanced means more features. In the desert, advanced means fewer failure points. A plastic object shipped from a factory may look newer than a leather one stitched by hand, but when it cracks in heat, cannot be repaired, and becomes trash in the sand, what exactly made it superior? The desert asks a ruthless question of every invention. Will it still work out here? That is why old technologies remain alive in places like this. Not because people are trapped in the past, but because some solutions were already nearly perfect for the conditions they were built to face. And yet, this is not a story about purity. It is not true that the Tuareg live untouched by the modern world. They have been touched by it deeply. Motor vehicles altered caravan economies. Borders cut across older routes. Markets changed what was profitable. Droughts in the 20th century devastated herds and eroded traditional pastoral life in many areas. Conflict in the Sahel made movement more dangerous. Urbanization pulled families toward towns. Young people learned to navigate two realities at once: the inherited logic of the desert and the accelerating demands of the state, the market, and technology. That tension is visible everywhere. A beautifully carved saddle may sit not far from a truck. Traditional dress may appear beside imported fabric. A drum may sound in one moment, and electric instruments powered by a generator in the next. This is what many outsiders miss when they come searching for the last untouched tribe. There are no untouched people. There are only people negotiating pressure with varying degrees of freedom. And the Tuareg have been negotiating for a very long time. With empire, with trade, with climate, with modern states, with extraction, with tourism, with war, with the temptation and sometimes the necessity of settlement. So if the headline sounds simple, the reality is not. The real story is not that modern tools never arrived. The real story is that even after they arrived, they did not fully replace the older architecture of life, because a phone cannot teach you where the next usable pasture lies. A truck cannot always go where a camel can. A factory-made object cannot automatically replace a handmade one when the handmade version is easier to repair 100 kilometers from the nearest paved road. And convenience in a fragile environment is not always the same thing as resilience. That is why certain scenes still repeat themselves across the desert with a rhythm that would be familiar to ancestors centuries ago. A tent rising against early light. A woman arranging the interior space with precision learned from others before her. Tea being poured slowly, then poured again. Men adjusting saddles. Animals being watered carefully. Tools being checked before movement. A blade sharpened. A leather strap repaired. A child learning not from instructions, but from repetition. In much of the industrial world, knowledge gets outsourced quickly. You forget how something works because you can buy another one. You stop repairing because replacement is cheap. You stop observing because an app can tell you. But life in harsher landscapes preserves a different kind of intelligence. Not abstract, not theoretical, embodied. How to read wind from the movement of sand. How to judge distance before sunrise. How to protect water. How to pack weight. How to recognize when an animal is tiring. How to sit, move, cover, wait, and conserve. How to host a stranger in a place where refusal may have fatal consequences. Hospitality in the desert is not politeness. It is ethics under extreme conditions. And perhaps that is another reason traditional tools remain meaningful here. They are woven into a moral world, not just a material one. A tea set is about welcome. A tent is about family structure and shared space. A saddle is about movement, work, and duty. Jewelry and amulets are not simply decorative. They carry memory, lineage, identity, belief. A useful object can also say who you are. And when a people have spent centuries being described by outsiders, controlled by outsiders, exoticized by outsiders, or pushed by forces larger than themselves, those objects matter even more. They become quiet declarations. We know how to live here. We were not waiting to be taught. This is where the word primitive completely collapses. Nothing about surviving in the Sahara is primitive. It is specialized, highly specialized. And specialization often looks simple to people who do not understand it. A camel saddle can look plain until you imagine a week without it. A tent can look minimal until you realize it must become home, shade, protection, and transportable architecture all at once. A leather bag can look ordinary until you understand that every seam matters when your life is moving. This is why many modern systems, for all their power, remain strangely brittle. They depend on long supply chains, stable roads, cheap fuel, replacement parts, and distant maintenance. Traditional desert systems were built for interruption. They assume uncertainty. They assume scarcity. They assume that what breaks must be fixed by the people already present. That is not backwardness. That is resilience. But resilience comes at a cost. The same life that preserves old knowledge also demands enormous labor. Heat, thirst, distance, exposure, animal loss, unpredictable pasture, political borders, drought, markets that value the image of tradition more than the people forced to maintain it. For younger generations, the choice is not always romantic. To leave may mean education, medicine, safety, cash, options. To stay may mean obligation, inheritance, identity, skill, and continuity. And increasingly, families are forced to live between those worlds. Part of the year in movement, part of the year more settled, part of life in inherited patterns, part of life in negotiation with schools, roads, administration, commerce, and phones. That does not mean tradition disappears overnight. Usually, it thins first. A route is traveled less often. An object is bought instead of made. A repair skill is remembered by fewer people. A song loses context. A child learns one language more fluently than another. A camp becomes a house. A house becomes a town memory. And then one day, outsiders say a culture vanished, when in truth it was pressed, narrowed, taxed, fenced, marketed, romanticized, and exhausted long before it disappeared. That is why the survival of older Tuareg tools matters. Not because they prove a people refused history, but because they prove a people kept choosing what worked, even under pressure to abandon it. Sometimes the oldest object in a place is not there because nothing changed. It is there because change was judged carefully and accepted selectively. That is wisdom. Not all new things improve life. Not all old things deserve to stay. The art is in knowing the difference. And desert societies, more than most, have had to become experts in that distinction. A bad choice is punished quickly here. The wrong route, the wrong load, the wrong object, the wrong assumption about water, weather, or animal strength, any of it can become serious. So over time, a culture forms around disciplined attention. Attention to the land, attention to materials, attention to use, attention to what cannot be wasted. That may be the deepest thing the modern world misreads when it looks at people like the Tuareg. It sees absence. No skyscrapers, no highways, no abundance of manufactured goods. But often what is really present is refinement. Refinement through necessity. Refinement through repetition. Refinement through generations of failure remembered and corrected. In that sense, the desert is one of the harshest schools humans have ever entered. And the people who learned to stay there did not do so because they lacked invention. They did so because they possessed enough invention to build a life that matched the land. So no, this is not a story about a tribe that somehow missed the last 800 years. It is a story about a people whose essential tools were so well adapted that 800 years of upheaval could not easily erase them. A people who understood that survival is not about using the newest object. It is about using the right one. A people who learned that movement can be a home, that repair can be a form of wealth, that restraint can be more powerful than excess, and that an object made by hand can still outperform the promises of distant industry. And maybe that is why these scenes still feel so startling to us, because they expose a quiet flaw in the mythology of progress. We like to believe history moves in one direction, from simple to complex, from old to new, from handmade to machine-made, from local knowledge to universal systems. But the desert keeps interrupting that story. It reminds us that progress without fit is failure, that convenience without durability is weakness, that speed without wisdom is just haste, and that somewhere beneath all our layers of technology, human life still depends on the same ancient questions. Can you move? Can you carry what matters? Can you protect your people? Can you find water? Can you repair what breaks? Can you live with the land without pretending you control it? The Tuareg answer those questions in a language partly modern, partly ancient, and wholly their own. That is what survives here. Not a museum piece, not a fantasy of the past, but a living intelligence shaped by the Sahara and tested over centuries. And maybe that is the real reason their old tools still matter. Because in a world addicted to replacing everything, they still remember how to keep something, how to use it well, how to mend it, how to pass it on, and how to build a life around what endures.